What's going on, guys? I'm Pete, and welcome to Retro Game Attic. I, like many others, am a huge old-school Sega fan. Having lived through their golden age in the 80s and 90s, I can attest that there's no shortage of amazing games from their back catalog. Nonetheless, the well of retro Sega goodness has been kind of hit or miss recently, so I was excited to hear about a somewhat recent game release from legendary Sega game designer and programmer Yu Suzuki. That game is Airtwister, which saw a console release back in November of last year. This game oozes old-school Sega charm and harkens back to the 32-bit era of gaming, so join me as I take a closer look into it. Airtwister is the brainchild of Yu Suzuki and his studio YSNet. Suzuki is responsible for such old-school Sega hits as Hang On, Space Harrier, Outrun, Virtua Racing, and many, many more. The dude was a serious hitmaker for Sega back in the day, all the way through his departure from the company in 2011. The concept of Airtwister originated from a conceptual version of Space Harrier for smartphones, which the game seems to parallel, despite Suzuki's reluctance to call Airtwister a spiritual successor to Space Harrier. It's pretty clear that the game shares some of its DNA with Space Harrier for sure, though. According to a 2022 GameSpot interview, Suzuki drew inspiration for Airtwister from the Ultima series, Mystery House, which is a 1980 Apple II horror game, and the previous Sega rail shooters Panzer Dragoon and Rez. Airtwister was initially released for Apple Arcade in 2022 and was more recently ported to consoles on November 10th, 2023. I am a bit of a console snob and I don't really play mobile games, so the fact that Airtwister originated on the Apple Arcade platform did kind of scare me off, but I decided to bite the bullet and purchase the Nintendo Switch physical version off Amazon for $24. As previously mentioned, Airtwister is a rail shooter presented in a third-person perspective where you take control of the game's protagonist, Princess Ark, to save her planet from impending doom. It's an arcade game by nature, so I personally don't care about the story. All I want to do is shoot the bad guys, of which there's over 20 unique enemies throughout the game. Upon starting the first stage, you are greeted with a familiar "Get ready," a la Space Harrier. It's kind of hard not to draw similarities when looking at Princess Ark and Harrier floating around blasting baddies side by side. Some of the enemies resemble Space Harrier baddies, and even the enemy fire in Airtwister resembles Space Harrier. I kind of sensed Panzer Dragoon vibes during some points of the game when you're riding a helper animal to defeat certain bosses, as well as in Stage 1 when you're flying close to the water throughout the level and defeat a dragon-like boss. The font or typeface used throughout the game was reminiscent of Nights into Dreams, and the forest stage reminded me of Fantasy Zone for some reason. I'm not sure if any of these similarities were intentional or if I was the one making the Sega associations. Regardless, a game shouldn't rely too heavily on the past, which is where Airtwister puts its own twist on the typical old-school arcade formula. I was a bit nervous during the pre-game practice mode when I was prompted to touch the screen. My heart sank as I thought this was going to be a lazy port of a mobile game with no physical control support, but my fear subsided upon finding out that the game did have traditional controls as well. Crisis averted. I think the game is much better suited for button controls over touchscreen controls. The game features 12 unique stages with pretty stunning visuals given its humble mobile game origins. Don't expect AAA greatness in the visuals because this is an indie game at heart after all. But what's here is great all things considered. I should also mention that I played solely on my undocked OLED Switch, so games typically look a little bit better on it than if it was docked to a TV. Princess Ark can deal attacks while tapping buttons for a direct fire or tracing a lock-on reticle over enemies for a homing shot. I found myself using the homing shot quite a bit in the later levels since I was constantly moving around the screen to avoid enemy fire. Each stage's atmosphere is extremely distinct. The practice mode seems straight out of Space Harrier. There's a desert stage, a futuristic stage, an outer space stage, and so on. From what I've described, the levels shouldn't feel like a cohesive work, but they're just so wacky that they all still work together. So much so that I wanted to see what kind of craziness was waiting for me during my initial playthrough. There's a total of 10 bosses, with all of them being well designed and straightforward to defeat. They're not bullet sponges, and all felt balanced, with the final boss being my favorite since the rigid polygonal design was very reminiscent of the 32-bit era. The Rez inspiration was definitely felt during that final boss fight. Princess Ark controls well, given the simplistic on-rails nature of the game. She basically controls very similar to to Harrier of Space Harrier. Think of the good 32X and Saturn ports or the arcade, and that's how she controls. Stars are collected throughout the game to unlock character wardrobe items, weapon upgrades, bonus modes, health increases, and others to pad out the experience. I didn't mess around with the extra content too much and just focused on weapon upgrades to make my life a little bit easier during subsequent playthroughs. But it seems like there's a ton of content to unlock and keep it fresh if you wanted to keep going for 100%. The game can be beaten in about 30 minutes on normal difficulty, which is pretty on par for an arcade-style game. I had a good amount of fun on my first playthrough and enjoyed it even more on my second time around. Now, I feel like I've gotten so far here without talking about the music. The music for the game is so strange. It's done by Dutch singer Valencia, whom Suzuki is a fan of. It's total fantasy prog / glam rock a la Queen or The Darkness that totally seems so goofy and out of place when I first heard it. I can't play much due to copyright, but here's a little snippet. I have to admit though, after beating the game, I found myself humming and singing tunes from it throughout the day. My opinion towards the music has totally changed. I think it's so strange that it actually works with the weirdness of the game itself. I can't really explain it, but it just works for some reason. Overall, I really did enjoy Airtwister. It's definitely not a game for everyone. I can see a lot of people being turned off by the somewhat weird stage aesthetics and unconventional soundtrack. I also think it did rely a bit heavily on its inspirations and played it a little too safe by not bringing many new ideas to the table. But with those very small complaints aside, I still think it's worth picking up, and you can get it for a pretty cheap price. A physical copy is $30 on Amazon at the time of this video, which still seems like a fair price. Either way, I say don't sleep on this game if you're a Sega fan or just want to experience a retro-inspired rail shooter. The sheer fact that this game exists in the modern era is awesome. It's a good time, with a goofy yet killer soundtrack, and I hope we get to play more Yu Suzuki projects in the future. So how about you guys? Is the Golden Age Sega nostalgia enough to sell you on Airtwister? Please be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. I love hearing from you guys. Thank you so much for watching Retro Game Attic. I really do appreciate you all. Have an awesome day, and I will see you on the next video.